Well, welcome back, and isn't it great to be in the Word every day? You know, Jesus prayed for us that the Father would sanctify us by the truth, which is His Word. And if Jesus prayed that for us, we can be pretty sure that that's a prayer that's being fulfilled. So every time you are in God's Word, He is sanctifying you, He is setting you apart, your mind, your emotions, your will to Himself. Slowly, bit by bit, sometimes imperceptibly from our perspective, we're being conformed into Christ's image more and more. So good for you for being in the Word. Today we are in chapter 40 of Ezekiel, a section that begins talking about the restoration of the temple. You know, it's interesting, since chapter 33, we've been looking at prophecies of the defeat of Israel's enemies and the restoration of Israel. So it's kind of in the flow of history that in these verses 40 to 46, we see the temple being restored. And then after that, verses 47 and 48, restoration to the land. A lot of people ask when they come to these chapters, 40 to 46, is this a literal temple? There's really three views on that. Let me make you aware of it. One view is that these are instructions for a post-captivity temple. That is, after they return to the land from their Babylonian exile, but instructions that were never carried out. So that's one view. Another view is that the instructions here are kind of an allegory or a metaphor for the church, that this is telling us about the church that's coming, and it's looking forward to that, and we're supposed to look at it from the perspective of the church and see the church here. The third view, and the view I adopt in this, throughout in the Word, and in this section focusing on the temple, is that this is a literal, physical, future millennial temple that's coming. Why do I say that? Why do I think it's literal? Well, a few reasons why. Number one is Ezekiel's other prophecies have been literal. Why not this one? Some prophecies that Ezekiel made that were fulfilled in his day were fulfilled literally. Other prophecies that are coming, they should be fulfilled literally too. Why not? We see in chapters 8 to 11 that the Lord's glory, His Spirit, His physical manifestation of His presence really leaves the temple. So when we come to chapter 43, in the section we're at now, we see the glory return to the millennial temple. So if there is a physical removal of God's glory in verses 8 to 11, why not a physical return of God's glory in verse 43? Also, as we go through these, there's lots and lots of detail here about the temple. Moses was provided similar level of detail for the tabernacle, that movable temple, as we can say, that traveled with Israel from the book of Exodus right through the beginning of Solomon's reign till the temple was constructed. That was a literal temple. Why not understand these exact specifications that we're about to look at to also point to a literal temple? I think we should. Sometimes people will say that, well, Ezekiel's the only one who talks about this, but that's not true. Other prophets speak of a millennial temple that is also best understood as a literal temple. So make note of these verses and go look at them later. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 3. Isaiah chapter 60, verse 13, Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, and Haggai chapter 2, verses 7 through 9. They all talk about a future temple where the Lord will reign. Another thing to notice as we go through this is that this temple will not fit into today's Jerusalem. The very high mountain, for example, talked about in verse 2, I think is a anticipation or the result of topographic changes that are going to happen to Israel at the time of Jesus' return. Again, you can look at Zechariah 14, verse 4, and Isaiah 2:2 to see these allusions to these topographic changes. Also, as we get ready to go through these verses in these chapters, not just today's chapter, but the subsequent chapters as well, we have some really what I consider to be, and again, I don't mean to be irreverent here, but really mind-numbing detail. We see lots of redundant descriptions and the use of obscure or really what may be unknown architectural terms. In fact, if you have a study Bible and you're going through this, you might notice in the notes of your study Bible that there's comments about not quite sure what some of these terms mean. All that to say, it's okay to skim through this section. You don't have to feel guilty by skimming through it as we go through all this detail. So I'm going to provide you with an outline here that'll help you make your way through chapter 40. Verses 1 through 4 is a man with a measuring rod. Probably a rod and a line is a better description. Verses 5 through 7, we see a description of the outer courts of the temple. And then 28 through 46, the inner courts. And the chapter ends with Ezekiel standing basically on the porch to the temple itself. So we're going from the outer courts to the inner courts to the temple is the progression that we're seeing here. And in verses 1 through 4, we're first encountering a man with a measuring rod. Verse 1 is the very last time marker. I think this is the 13th in Ezekiel. We said at the outset that Ezekiel, in contrast to Jeremiah, is really good at nailing us in history, telling us exactly where he's at. Jeremiah was more topical. Ezekiel really anchors us in historical facts, historical time frame. This particular one is April 573. This is when this vision comes. It's interesting, in chapter 8, Ezekiel was brought into the temple to see the abominations, the desecration. Here is a stark contrast. He's brought into a future temple to witness its glory. So let's take a look here. In verse 3, we see a man. This man is later called the Lord in chapter 44, verses 4 and 5. So this man might be an angel of the Lord, or it might be a pre-incarnate vision of Jesus. Some people think that the angel of the Lord is in fact synonymous with a pre-incarnate vision of Jesus. So we may see Jesus himself, who will reign in this temple in the future, conducting the Torah. Interesting thought, isn't it? Verse 3 also talks about a line that was used for longer measurements, this flax line, and also a rod. Now, the rod that's being talked about here is about 10.5 feet long. So one is used for long measurements, one are usually shorter measurements. Starting in verse 5, then we get into the details. Of the outer court, verses 5 through 27. As you work your way through this, again, okay to skim, verses 6 through 19, we start with the east gate. This will be the gate through which the returning glory will arrive and come into the temple, so it's appropriate we start with that. And that east gate has a lot of detail in it that is not covered on the north gates and south gates. Because it's kind of redundant. All the gates are going to look very similar. So in verses 6 through 19, we see the east gate. 20 to 23, the north. 24 through 27, the south gate. Verses 8 through 16, as we make our way through this, we see what's basically accommodations for the priests that are going to be caring for the temple. So verses 8 through 16 talk about their accommodations. There's going to be what I would say is groups of priests that take turns ministering for a period of time in the temple, and this is their accommodations while they were there. Verses 17 through 37 then, as we go through these sections, describe the temple area. And as you go through these, starting in verse 17, but going on, as you go through these areas, note the frequency, the repetition of the numbers 5 and 25 and 50 and 100 throughout the description. This is characteristic of the dimensions, multiples of 5, and very regular squares that are being described here, very regular shapes. Drop down to verse 28 then, and we see the inner courts. So we start with the outside, the outer courts, we go to the inner courts. And in this case, the description starts with the south gate in verses 28 through 31. And then the east gate, which again will be very important, in 32 through 34. And then the north gate in 35 through 37. So this is how this is divided up. Notice in chapter 40, verses 38 through 43, there's this chambers, it says, for offerings. Let's take a look at that. It says, a chamber with its doorway was by the side pillars at the gates. There they rinsed the burnt offering. So this sets people's brains on fire. It raises the question of why are we having sacrifices if Jesus has already fulfilled them all? Why are we having sacrifices if the true Lamb of God, the one to whom all the sacrifices pointed, is present? Basically, 4 explanations have been offered. One is a memorial offering. One is a fellowship offering to restore fellowship that maybe is lost during the millennial kingdom as sin continues. There's also the view that this is to restore ritual cleansing, ritual purification, and also a view to restore theocratic harmony, that is, harmony between the king and his nation. So I have not going to describe or discuss each of those in detail here. Let me refer you to a video that I'll be putting a link in the notes below, a video that focuses specifically on Ezekiel's temple that you might find helpful. I talk about when it arrives, why it arrives, and what the purpose is, and why there's going to be sacrifices in my view. Again, there's multiple views, but in my view, why there's going to be sacrifices. Notice also in verses 44 through 46 that there are chambers for singers and priests, so there is going to be, again, worship going on in this temple. Ministry is going to be happening. Verse 48 talks about the Zadokite priests. Let's take a look at that. It says, he said to me, this is the chamber which faces toward the south, intended for the priests who keep my temple. But the chamber which faces toward the north is for the priests who keep charge of the altar. These are the sons of Zadok, who from the sons of Levi come near to the Lord to minister to him. So we have this class of priests, the Zadokite priests, that have specific altar duties. These priests were also serving in Solomon's temple. You can look at 1 Kings, for example, chapter 1, or Numbers 25 through 13, where in fact God made a covenant with Phinehas, their forefather, because Phinehas honored God when Eli's sons would not. So the Zadokite priesthood is set apart. Verse 47, we see this altar where the sacrifices will occur. It's going to be repeated later in Ezekiel chapter 43. Then we come to the end here, verses 48 and 49, where Ezekiel is entering the temple. That's how I labeled these two verses. He's brought to the entrance of the temple proper, and there's this stairways are introduced. And if you can imagine, there's these successive stairways in the description that shows that as you approach the temple itself, you go from the outer court to the inner court to the temple. The temple is lifted up. The temple is prominent in this, the temple itself, in this whole temple complex. So that's what we see here. What is our takeaway? How do we apply this and the subsequent chapters here of all this detail about the temple of the Lord? Well, we apply it by remembering that God's promise to be among his people, that God's promise from Eden onward is to be among his people, to rule and reign, not from a distance, but with them. And what we see in these chapters is God is preparing to do that. His glory is going to return. He's going to dwell among his people. He'll be ruling and reigning over Israel. The church, we're told in the book of Revelation, will reign and rule with him. We will all be present, and Jesus himself, God himself, will be present in the temple. What a glorious thing to look forward to, brothers and sisters. Well, God bless you in your study. And again, remember, there's a video link below about the temple itself. And again, it's okay to skim through these sections with all this detail. God bless you, brothers and sisters. God bless you in your reading of Ezekiel.